It's good to see you. Most of my childhood memories of Thanksgiving took place at my paternal grandparents' home in Thornwood, New York. I remember the smells. I remember their 1960s appliances. I remember falling asleep on the soft rug in their den, overfilled with a Thanksgiving meal, listening to the sound of a football game, and warmed by a furnace that was set about 10 degrees hotter than I knew a furnace could be set. I remember being bored by the stories my grandfather would tell about people and places I didn't know. I remember hearing about how he grew up on a farm in Nova Scotia, Canada, and that as a teenager, he moved to Lynn, Massachusetts, where his parents had some extended family. He made passing references to how there had been some Freemans in Massachusetts for generations. The legend or the story he would have told was that when the rebels and the king started to get into a little bit of a trouble, his side of the family packed up all their things and fled to Nova Scotia. James Freeman, who I called Grandpa Jim, lived to be about 102. He died in 2015. As I grew older, I had become incredibly close with him. He was maybe the first person I told that I was seriously thinking about going to seminary and thinking about pursuing the ministry. He was incredibly supportive and very interested, and he even did a little bit of research. A few times near the end of his life, he told me that if he had to do it all over again, he thought maybe he'd be a Unitarian rather than an Episcopalian. I don't know if that's true or not, but it really stuck with me, and I love that. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about Grandpa Jim and imagine what he might have to say about the state of the world right now or about my current vocational path. Now let's fast forward a couple of years. As I grew more serious about pursuing Unitarian Universalist ministry, and I grew more comfortable with the stories and language and themes of the Christianity of my youth, I learned that in 1785, King's Chapel in Boston updated the Episcopalian, the Anglican Book of Common Prayer to reflect a Unitarian rather than a Trinitarian understanding of God. It had caused a mighty stir, and it sounded like something I'd be interested in. And I discovered that King's Chapel is still publishing copies. This is the 9th and most recent edition. It's become part of my personal prayer practice. I've shared prayers from it with some of you. I also learned that the person who led the initial revision was an Anglican named James Freeman. Now, that sounded familiar. When memories of my Grandpa Jim's stories of people Freemans being in the Boston area started to come back to me, I thought, that'd be pretty incredible if I could tie myself to this person, that if I could tie my own Unitarian Universalist faith, which has oftentimes felt like a step away from my family, if I could tie it back to this James Freeman, to this particular ancestor. Turns out I can't, but it was still an interesting practice. And I spent a lot of time on Ancestry.com and other places trying desperately to find a connection. I figured maybe he's not a direct ancestor, maybe he's a distant cousin. That would still be pretty cool, I thought. This became a little bit of an obsession, trying to connect myself, trying to connect Grandpa Jim to this other James Freeman. So I just kept climbing back further into the family tree to see if I might find some sort of connection. Eventually, I landed on a man named Major John Freeman. He was my 8th great-grandfather. Major John, I thought. That's an interesting name. I wonder what that's all about. So I Googled him, and it turns out he was some kind of official on the Plymouth plantation, and he had served in something called the King Philip's War. The websites I found treated him as a hero. But I read, well, as your teacher told you, and I have a sense of the history of the Plymouth plantation, and I knew it couldn't end well. So I stepped away. I figured it was better to learn more about James Freeman of King's Chapel than Major John Freeman of Plymouth. Fast forward one more time, this time to this summer's UUA General Assembly. One of the two actions of immediate witness our denomination passed calls our congregations to actively name and repair the harm caused by 400 years of white supremacist colonization in the United States. The resolution is powerful, and I invite you to read it later. A link has already been posted in the chat. I was one of the 94% of delegates who proudly voted to adopt this resolution, and it caused me to look again into Major John Freeman's history and how he might be connected to this story. I got just a little bit deeper, and it was not good news. King Philip, it turns out, of King Philip's War, was actually the name the English settlers had given to a chief named Metacom. He was the chief of the Wampanoag people. He formed a coalition with 3 other tribes, and for 14 months led an uprising against the English colonizers. Okay, I told myself, that's really enough. My ancestor was involved in the Plymouth invasion and the subsequent oppression of indigenous people, and that alone evoked deep feelings of shame and guilt. It disrupted my understanding of who I am, what my family history is. So I figured it was better to walk away again, one more time, just to protect myself, I thought. Let's fast forward one last time. Now it's Tuesday, this Tuesday, in our worship planning meeting. We were discussing how we might spend some time today considering the fraught history of Thanksgiving within the context of friction and heartache that teach us lessons. I sheepishly raised my hand, said I was pretty sure I have this connection to that history, and it's been causing me heartache over the last couple of years, and that I might be willing to share. And so Reverend Rebekah said, great, let's do that. And here I am sharing my secrets. So friends, I'm here to tell you that I'm now deeper into the heartache. On Wednesday, I stumbled across a 2019 article from New England Quarterly, written by a historian and professor of Indigenous Studies. What I learned was that Major John Freeman was essentially the Jared Kushner of the Plymouth colony. Major John had married Mercy Prince, the daughter of Thomas Prince, a passenger on the Mayflower and the longtime governor of the Plymouth colony. The historian wrote it plainly: Freeman leveraged these ties to improve his own status and wealth, as well as functioning as an agent of the colony's interests. So yeah, Jared Kushner. But also it turns out he was much worse. In this article, I was confronted with the fact that when he died, Major John Freeman bequeathed enslaved Africans and indigenous people to his descendants as human property. I was confronted with the fact that Major John Freeman had personally participated in the massacre of the Great Swamp, in which 300 indigenous men, women, and children were killed, including many who were burned alive at the stake. I also learned that after Metacom's fight for freedom from colonial rule had been suppressed, Major John Freeman wrote to Josiah Winslow, who was governor at the time, and he shared that it had been his idea, Major John Freeman's idea, to retrieve the defeated chief's head, which was then mounted outside the fortifications at Plymouth. Like I said, I'm still in the chaos. I'm still in the friction. I'm still in the heartache. But it's a heartache I've held at bay too long. It turns out I'm not surprised to know that many people who shared my genetics were involved in this genocide. But I am surprised to learn that they played a leadership role. As I mentioned, I've walked up to the edge of this truth a few times, only to retreat. I knew the truth was there, I just wanted to avoid it. So I am ashamed, but I'm not surprised. What I find interesting, though, is that how I've responded to this shame, how I've tried to find quick ways to separate myself from it. I've sought to find ways to deny that it's something I even need to reckon with. Maybe the genealogical records were wrong. Maybe someday I'll find that instead I'm still actually related to this James Freeman rather than to Major John Freeman. Or maybe I should think about how long ago it was. That's 10 generations. Did you know that every living person has 1,024 eighth great grandparents? That's something I learned this week. Thought it might make me feel a little better. So I've sought to deny that I've had any responsibility. And I've tried to convince myself that I'm fully responsible for it and that I alone can solve it. What if I sell everything I have and give it to the Wampanoag tribe? Can I write a check and make the shame go away? What if I make a public confession? Would that absolve me of any complicity? What if I make it my life's work to fix this problem, as though history is something that can actually be fixed? My personal experience trying to avoid this shame reminds me of how we as a nation respond to the shameful stories of our collective past. The truth is, we can't deny this history. I can't deny this history, nor can I fix it. No matter how much I want to avoid this feeling of shame and this heartache, I can only sit with it. I can only share my story with others. I can hope that it will transform us. Now, I know that I will be changed by this story. And I know that we can be changed by this story and the countless stories like it. But this is the scariest part for me. I know I can't control how this transformation will come.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to scroll through and say hello and hello. Hello, good morning. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Kirk, for sharing this morning. I'm going to take us a little bit somewhere else for a moment. For the last few weeks, with the gracious and amazing support of Marianne Miller and Margie Henry, we have launched our one-on-ones project with the Rev, where I've been able to meet dozens of you face to face. I see a few of you who I've met with and had some time together, half an hour, 45 minutes, all the way up to an hour. And yes, I really do want to spend time with each and every member and friend of UUCR because you're amazing and generous with your time and your trust. Already, so many connections have been made, insights and truths have been shared, and a few tears shed, and even some of mine. And inspiration is everywhere. The good idea fairy continues to be on overdrive. I had a good and deep conversation with a couple that shared with me a homily they heard during our Rosh Hashanah service recently that stayed with me. It was about Jonah and the whale. I had to find my child's sculpture of the whale. You may be familiar with this story from the book of Jonah in the Hebrew scriptures. Jonah was one of the 12 prophets in the Tanakh, or the Hebrew scriptures. Jonah was a teacher that lived in the northern part of the kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BCE. This story is also included in the Quran since Jonah is revered as a prophet of Islam and an apostle of Allah as well. The story goes that God called to Jonah one day and told him to go to Nineveh to preach, and Jonah refused. Jonah felt like the Nineveh people were enemies of Israel and wanted very little to do with them. Jonah tried to run away from God, from God's command, and went in the opposite direction by jumping on a boat and headed to Tarshish. Well, the story goes, as you may remember, that God sends a huge storm around the ship to get Jonah's attention. And the sailors and Jonah thought they were all going to perish. And Jonah, knowing that he's kind of responsible for this great storm, tells the sailors, "Hey, throw me overboard." And they do. And the storm dissipates. So God sends a dag gadol, or a giant fish, commonly known as a whale, which swallowed up Jonah and saved him from drowning in the sea. Jonah, now in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, Jonah prayed, asked for help, pleaded with God, and repented. Jonah was ashamed. He praised God in the belly of the whale, and in return, he was delivered to the shores of Nineveh. What caught my attention about Jonah's story are the close parallels to the journeys that Kirk and Matthew both shared with us this morning. Both Kirk and Matthew have been confronted with what feels like being in the belly of the whale, that confusion, that despair, that heartbreak, that pushing away, attempts to distance themselves from uncomfortable feelings and knowledge. We all know that place. We all know that all too human pattern when asked to rise to a moment, rise to an opportunity or a challenge. We often prefer to run away in the opposite direction, hop on that metaphorical boat, and get out of town. Who me, pray? Who me reconcile with a challenging past? Who me offer forgiveness? Who me share my rage with the world? Who me share my tender bits, my hurts? Who me? And then there is that time in the Dag Gadol, that giant fish. Jonah had no idea how long he would last in the belly of the whale. Jonah had no idea if he could even survive in the belly of the whale. That was chaos, for sure. The uncertainty, the fear, the despair, the endless days and nights that seem to last an eternity, kind of like now. Yes. The blurring of each day and that only brings more of the same. We feel alone, cast adrift, isolated, and afraid. Jonah turned that time into a turning within, a time to dig into his faith, to talk to God. There was a rebirth for Jonah in the belly of the whale. There was transformation and clarity in the belly of the whale. Sufi teacher Ilyat Inyat Khan wisely shared, "There can be no rebirth without a dark night of the soul, a total annihilation of all that you believed and thought that we are." Or as Valerie Carr asks us, is this the darkness of the womb or the darkness of the tomb? In wrestling, in confrontation of hard truths about ourselves, our history, our world, and our country, we are able to emerge anew. Just like the work we are doing here in dismantling white supremacy culture, here and around the country, and telling the truth about Thanksgiving. We all have been sold the lies of a Thanksgiving table of generous and magnanimous equals, the Pilgrims and the indigenous people breaking bread together as friends. Now, we know that story is not true. That image has been romanticized and spun and colorized to make a point to erase a painful history. There was repeated betrayal of trust and contracts as the first people of the land lost their culture, their connection to their ancestral homes, and their lives by the millions. 55 million indigenous people lost their lives. And we are thrown back into the belly of the whale to face these facts of history. The land that UCR sits on is on the ancestral land of the Piscataway people. We say their name, the Piscataway people. We honor the first people of this land. I encourage you to find out more about their history and find out the people that still live here in this area, keeping their culture and their history together. I encourage you to read the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States and dig into our shared complicity in this cultural erasure and genocide. And as Kirk posted, read The Action of Immediate Witness from General Assembly. It is only by letting hard truths and the discomfort of our times find rest in our spirits that we are able to navigate to a better place. A more whole place where alignment and our collective freedom are our clarion call. As Afrofuturist Octavia Butler wrote, everything you touch, you change. Everything you change touches you. The only everlasting truth is change. God is change. But it's that first part. Everything you change changes you. Everything you touch, you change. By getting in touch with that history, a part of ourselves and who we are, we become changed. And for this, my beloveds, I am grateful. For this wrestling, for this pain, for these confrontations, the chaos and being in the belly of the whale, the struggles with finding out who we are and how we are called to be, I am grateful. For love and generosity, I am grateful. For forgiveness and grace that abounds in this space, I am grateful. For the strength of this community and for all of us as people of faith and covenant, I am grateful. For the compassion and challenges, I am grateful. And yes, I was called Chaplain Pollyanna as a military chaplain. But this gratitude is not a Pollyanna wish for a simpler times of not knowing. This gratitude is clarity for being given the gifts of hard truths, for being given the gifts of discomfort so we can wrestle deeply and arise to our highest aspirations towards the greatest good. Beloveds, now is our time to lead with love and make right the ways that we have fallen short of our shared principles. We are a powerful, aspirational people. We are a people of covenant, and we are being called to account for our historic, moral, and spiritual failings in order to move to a more authentic, beloved community. As I asked us last week, to feed the good and starve the bad. There's so much around us that is trying to drag us in the wrong direction of who we are as individuals, as a country, as a people. Feed the good, starve the bad. Nose around for those challenging spaces, for we are all better for it. And I'll close with this reminder from Adrienne Rich. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. Beloveds, let us reconstitute the world together. Amen. Blessed be, and may it be so.